Lady Catherine Whitmore stood at the grand window of Ashford Manor, her fingers trembling against the cold glass as she watched the morning mist roll across the estate grounds. The property that had been her sanctuary for 3 years now felt like a prison. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and hollow-eyed, bearing little resemblance to the confident woman who had once walked these halls as the Queen Consort's trusted companion. The letter in her hand crinkled as her grip tightened. Official royal seal, formal language, and a deadline that made her stomach churn. 7 days to vacate the premises. 7 days to pack up a life she had built stone by stone, memory by memory. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very woman who had gifted her this estate was now the one demanding its return. Catherine had met Queen Consort Isabella 3 years ago at a charity gala in London. Isabella, newly married to King Edward VII, had seemed lost among the crowd of dignitaries and socialites, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Catherine, then, working as an art curator, had approached the Queen with genuine warmth, offering to show her a private collection that wasn't part of the evening's display. That simple gesture had sparked an unlikely friendship between two women from vastly different worlds. "You understand beauty in ways others cannot," Isabella had told her one afternoon as they walked through the manor's gardens. "When I'm with you, I remember who I was before all of this." She had gestured vaguely at her elaborate gown, the ever-present security detail, the weight of the crown that wasn't physically there, but always pressing down on her shoulders. Their friendship had deepened quickly, perhaps too quickly. Isabella would escape to Ashford Manor whenever royal duties became overwhelming. They would spend hours talking about art, philosophy, and dreams that seemed impossible within the constraints of royal protocol. Catherine had provided something Isabella desperately needed, a space where she could simply be herself, not the perfect queen consort the public demanded. The manor had been Isabella's idea. "You need a proper place to display your work," she had insisted after seeing Catherine's cramped London apartment. "Somewhere worthy of your talent." The deed transfer had been handled discreetly through royal lawyers, presented as a gift to support the arts. Catherine had protested initially, uncomfortable with accepting something so valuable, but Isabella's enthusiasm had been infectious. "Think of it as a collaboration," Isabella had laughed, her eyes bright with excitement. "You'll create beautiful exhibitions, and I'll have a retreat where I can appreciate them properly. Everyone benefits." For 2 years, their arrangement had worked perfectly. Catherine had transformed the manor into a showcase for emerging artists, hosting intimate exhibitions that attracted collectors and critics from across Europe. Isabella would attend these events when her schedule allowed, moving through the crowds with genuine interest and joy. The Queen's presence had elevated Catherine's reputation in ways she could never have achieved alone. But everything had changed 6 months ago when King Edward announced his intention to divorce Isabella. The reasons given to the public were vague, diplomatic necessities, but Catherine knew the truth was far more complex and painful. Isabella had confided her struggles with the king's controlling nature, his demands as she completely abandoned her own interests and personality to become his ideal of royal perfection. "He wants a beautiful statue, not a wife," Isabella had whispered one evening as they sat by the manor's fireplace. "Someone who smiles when told to smile, speaks when told to speak, and disappears when no longer needed." The divorce proceedings had been brutal, conducted entirely behind closed doors, but with details occasionally leaking to the press. Isabella's reputation had been systematically destroyed through carefully placed stories about her inappropriate friendships and failure to understand royal duties. Catherine had watched helplessly as the vibrant, intelligent woman she knew was reduced to tabloid caricature. As Isabella's public image crumbled, so did Catherine's position. The art world that had once celebrated her now whispered about her connection to the disgraced queen. Collectors who had eagerly sought her expertise suddenly found reasons to work with other curators. The exhibitions that had once filled the manor with life and laughter dwindled to poorly attended gatherings of die-hard supporters. The final blow had come 3 weeks ago when Catherine received a visit from Lord Pemberton, King Edward's personal attorney. The man had been polite, but firm as he explained that all properties associated with the former queen consort were being reviewed. Since the manor had been gifted during Isabella's marriage to the king, it technically belonged to the crown estate. "I'm sure you understand the delicate nature of the situation," Lord Pemberton had said. His tone suggesting understanding was not optional. His Majesty feels it would be inappropriate for such a valuable property to remain connected to recent unpleasantness. Catherine had fought back tears of rage and frustration as she listened to her life being dismantled in legal terminology. The manor wasn't just a building to her. It was proof that she had mattered, that her work had value, that she had created something meaningful. Now it was being swept away as collateral damage in a royal divorce. She had tried to reach Isabella, but the former queen had seemingly vanished from public life after the divorce was finalized. Phone calls went unanswered, letters were returned unopened, and mutual friends claimed they had no idea where she was staying. Catherine was left to face the destruction of her world alone. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped Catherine back to the present. Mrs. Fletcher, the manor's longtime housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with a tea tray and a sympathetic expression. "Thought you might need something warm, miss," the older woman said softly. "Nasty business, all of this." Catherine accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. Mrs. Fletcher had worked at the manor long before Isabella had purchased it, and her loyalty had never wavered despite the uncertainty surrounding their futures. "What will you do?" Catherine asked. "After I'm gone, I mean." Mrs. Fletcher's weathered face creased into a sad smile. "Lord Pemberton mentioned they'll be needing a caretaker until the property sells. 40 years I've tended this place. I suppose I can manage a bit longer." The casual mention of selling the manor hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had foolishly hoped that perhaps the crown simply wanted to distance itself from the property temporarily, that maybe someday she might have a chance to return. But if they were planning to sell, it meant this truly was the end. "I keep thinking there must be something I can do," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some legal avenue, some way to fight this." Mrs. Fletcher set down her own cup and fixed Catherine with a knowing look. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you're thinking like someone who believes the law applies equally to everyone. When royalty wants something gone, it has a way of disappearing, no matter what papers might say otherwise." The harsh truth in those words settled over Catherine like a shroud. She had been naive to think her friendship with Isabella could protect her from the machinery of royal power. She was a commoner who had forgotten her place, and now she was paying the price for that presumption. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine forced herself to begin the overwhelming task of cataloging her possessions. Each item seemed to carry the weight of memory. The antique desk where she had written countless exhibition notes, the Persian rug Isabella had admired during her first visit, the collection of first-edition art books that had taken years to assemble. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant, James. 3 more collectors have canceled their appointments for next week. Word is spreading quickly. I'm sorry, Catherine. She stared at the message until the words blurred together. Even if she found a new place to live and work, rebuilding her reputation would take years, if it was possible at all. The art world was small and unforgiving. Her association with the royal scandal would follow her like a shadow, tainting every professional relationship she tried to establish. Evening fell with unusual swiftness, or perhaps Catherine had simply lost track of time while drowning in her own despair. She found herself back at the window where she had started the day, watching darkness claim the grounds she would soon lose forever. A movement near the main gate caught her attention. A figure stood in the shadows beyond the entrance, barely visible in the dim light from the street lamps. Catherine's heart jumped with wild hope. Could Isabella have finally come to explain, to help, to at least say goodbye? She watched for several minutes, but the figure remained motionless, neither approaching nor leaving. Eventually, Catherine realized it was probably just a curious journalist hoping for a story about the disgraced queen's former retreat. The press had been largely respectful of her privacy so far, but that courtesy wouldn't last much longer. The ringing of the manor's ancient telephone echoed through the empty halls, making Catherine jump. She hesitated before answering, unsure if she was ready to face more bad news. "Catherine? Thank God you answered." The voice was male, cultured, and vaguely familiar. "Who is this?" "Marcus Hartwell. We met at one of your exhibitions last year. I'm calling about Isabella." Catherine's pulse quickened. Marcus was a journalist, but one of the respectable ones who covered art and culture rather than scandal. If he was calling about Isabella, it might mean news rather than mere gossip. "What about her?" Catherine asked carefully. "She's in trouble, Catherine. Real trouble. I can't say more over the phone, but I think you should know that what's happening to you isn't just about the property. There are people who want to ensure that Isabella's side of recent events never becomes public, and that includes silencing anyone she might have confided in. The line went quiet except for the sound of Marcus's careful breathing. Catherine felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications of his words sank in. What are you saying exactly? I'm saying you might want to be very careful about what you say and to whom you say it in the coming days. And, Catherine, if you have any documents, letters, or recordings related to Isabella's time as Queen Consort, you should probably secure them somewhere safe. Very safe. The line went dead, leaving Catherine staring at the receiver in her shaking hand. She had assumed the worst thing that could happen was losing her home and reputation. The possibility that she might also be in actual danger had never occurred to her. She looked around the manor with new eyes, seeing potential threats in every shadow. The isolation that had once felt like peaceful retreat now seemed ominous. She was alone here except for Mrs. Fletcher, who retired to her cottage on the grounds each evening, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. Catherine's mind raced through her possessions, trying to remember what she had that might be considered sensitive. There were dozens of photos from Isabella's visits, casual snapshots of their friendship that showed the Queen in unguarded moments. There were personal letters Isabella had written, thanking Catherine for her friendship and confiding her struggles with royal life. Most damaging of all, there were several voice recordings Isabella had made while practicing speeches, where she had spoken candidly about her husband's treatment of her and her growing desire for freedom. At the time, these recordings had seemed like innocent documentation of their friendship. Isabella had been nervous about public speaking and had asked Catherine to help her practice. But now Catherine realized that those tapes contained explosive material. A queen speaking honestly about her marriage to a king, expressing doubts about the monarchy itself, revealing details about palace life that were never meant for public consumption. Catherine climbed the stairs to her private study, her footsteps echoing in the empty manor. The recordings were stored in a locked drawer of her desk, along with Isabella's letters and a journal Catherine had kept documenting their friendship. She had planned to write a book someday, a scholarly work about art patronage and royal influence. Now she realized that possessing such material might be incredibly dangerous. As she gathered the documents and recordings, Catherine found herself remembering specific conversations with Isabella. The Queen had spoken about feeling watched constantly, about suspecting that her private communications were being monitored. At the time, Catherine had assumed this was normal paranoia for someone in the public eye. But what if Isabella's fears had been justified? What if powerful people really were determined to control every aspect of her story? Catherine locked the sensitive materials in a waterproof case and hid behind a false panel in her bedroom wall. The hiding place was a remnant of the manor's history during World War II, when the previous owners had hidden valuables from potential invaders. She had discovered it by accident while renovating and had found it charming. Now it might be a lifeline. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Catherine was finishing her breakfast when Mrs. Fletcher knocked urgently on the dining room door. "Miss Catherine, there are men here to see you. They say they're from the royal household, but they're not dressed like the usual messengers." Catherine's blood turned cold. She looked out the window and saw a black sedan parked in her circular driveway, its windows too tinted to see inside. Two men in expensive suits stood beside it, their posture suggesting military or security training. "Tell them I'll be right there," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice steady. She had 5 minutes while Mrs. Fletcher delivered the message. Catherine used them to hide any remaining personal documents and to send a quick text to James. "Unexpected visitors. If you don't hear from me by evening, call Marcus Hartwell." She didn't know if Marcus could help, but he was the only person who seemed to understand the gravity of her situation. The men introduced themselves as representatives of the Crown Estate Office, but their credentials seemed deliberately vague. They were polite, but firm as they explained that they needed to conduct an immediate inventory of the manor's contents. "I understood I had 7 days," Catherine said, producing the official letter. "Circumstances have changed," the taller man replied. "We need to ensure that no property belonging to the Crown is removed from the premises." Catherine watched helplessly as the men began their systematic search of her home. They photographed everything, made detailed notes, and handled her personal possessions with clinical detachment. When they reached her study, she held her breath, but they showed no signs of finding the hidden compartment. Hours later, after the men had finally left, Catherine sat in her devastated home, trying to process what had happened. The inventory had been thorough to the point of invasion. They had examined her personal correspondence, her financial records, even her medical prescriptions. This wasn't about protecting Crown property. It was about gathering intelligence on her life and connections. As evening approached, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't simply wait for forces beyond her control to destroy her life completely. If powerful people wanted her silenced, then perhaps the best defense was to ensure her story could never be buried. She began writing, documenting everything she knew about Isabella's marriage, the divorce proceedings, and the systematic destruction of the former queen's reputation. She wrote through the night, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she poured out 3 years of observations and conversations. By dawn, she had created a detailed account that painted a very different picture of recent royal events than what the public had been told. It was dangerous material, the kind that could destroy reputations and careers if it ever became public. But it was also the truth, and perhaps that was worth the risk. Catherine sealed copies of her account with the hidden recordings and letters, creating a comprehensive package that told Isabella's real story. She addressed it to Marcus Hartwell with instructions to publish everything if something happened to her. Then, she waited for whatever would come next, knowing that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The morning brought news that would shatter the last of her illusions about the forces arrayed against her. Mrs. Fletcher arrived at breakfast time with a face white with shock and a newspaper trembling in her hands. "Miss Catherine," she whispered, "you need to see this." The headline read, "Former Queen Consort dies in car accident." Below was a photo of Isabella, beautiful and smiling in happier times. The article described a tragic single-car accident on a remote country road, with no witnesses and no clear explanation for why the former queen had lost control of her vehicle. Catherine stared at the newspaper until the words blurred together through her tears. Isabella was dead. The vibrant, intelligent woman who had become such an important part of her life was gone, and Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the timing was far too convenient to be coincidental. As she grieved for her lost friend, Catherine also realized that her own situation had become infinitely more dangerous. Isabella could no longer contradict whatever version of events powerful people chose to promote. The only remaining witness to the truth was Catherine herself, and she had just become a very inconvenient loose end that needed to be tied up permanently. Captain James Thornfield stood at attention in the oak-paneled office of Colonel Morrison, his uniform impeccable despite the early morning hour. The emergency summons had come at dawn, unusual even for the Royal Guard's demanding schedule. Through the tall windows, London's skyline was barely visible through a thick morning fog that seemed to mirror the uncertainty clouding James's thoughts. "At ease, Captain," Colonel Morrison said without looking up from the classified folders spread across his desk. "Close the door and take a seat. We have a delicate situation that requires your particular skills." James had served in the Royal Guard for 12 years, rising through the ranks based on his reputation for discretion and efficiency. He had protected visiting dignitaries, secured royal residences, and managed sensitive operations that never appeared in official reports. But something about the colonel's tone suggested this assignment would be different from anything he had handled before. "Sir, what's the nature of the operation?" Colonel Morrison finally looked up, his weathered face grave with concern. "Are you familiar with Lady Catherine Whitmore?" The name stirred a memory in James's mind. The art curator? Connected to the former Queen Consort? That's correct. Lady Whitmore has been residing at Ashford Manor for the past 3 years, a property that technically belongs to the Crown Estate. With recent developments regarding the former Queen Consort, the situation has become complicated. James waited patiently as the colonel chose his words carefully. In their line of work, complications usually meant political sensitivities that could damage the monarchy if handled poorly. Lady Whitmore has been given notice to vacate the property, but intelligence suggests she may possess materials that could prove embarrassing to the Crown if they were to become public. Your assignment is to ensure her safe relocation while also securing any sensitive documents or recordings that might exist. The phrasing struck James as deliberately ambiguous. "What kind of materials are we concerned about, sir?" Colonel Morrison's expression hardened. "Personal correspondence, photographs, voice recordings." The former queen consort was known to be indiscreet in her friendships. Lady Whitmore may have documentation of conversations or activities that would be harmful to royal dignity if misinterpreted by the press. James nodded, understanding the implications. The recent death of the former queen consort in a car accident had generated intense media scrutiny. Any suggestion of scandal or impropriety would be seized upon by tabloids looking for sensational stories. Protecting the monarchy's reputation often required preventing such material from ever reaching public attention. How should I approach Lady Whitmore? Is she expected to cooperate? Lady Whitmore appears to be an intelligent, reasonable woman who has found herself in an unfortunate situation through no fault of her own, the colonel replied. We believe she can be persuaded to act in everyone's best interests if the matter is handled with appropriate sensitivity. The unspoken message was clear. James was being asked to convince Catherine Whitmore to surrender potentially damaging materials voluntarily, avoiding the legal complications that might arise from forcible search. It was a delicate balance between protecting royal interests and respecting civil liberties. I'll need a cover story for my presence at the manor, James said. You'll be introduced as a security consultant hired to assess the property for its new owners. This gives you legitimate access while allowing for private conversations with Lady Whitmore about the sensitive nature of certain materials. Colonel Morrison handed James a thick file containing background information on Catherine Whitmore, detailed floor plans of Ashford Manor, and contact information for other personnel involved in the operation. As James reviewed the materials, he found himself impressed by Catherine's academic credentials and professional achievements. She had built a respected career in art curation before her association with the royal family, and her exhibitions had received critical acclaim. Sir, what's our timeline for this operation? Lady Whitmore is scheduled to vacate the property within 6 days. We need those materials secured before she leaves, preferably with her full cooperation. The last thing we want is a situation where she feels persecuted or victimized. That would only invite more media attention. James spent the rest of the morning studying Catherine's background and preparing for what he hoped would be a straightforward conversation between reasonable adults. His driver picked him up at noon for the journey to Ashford Manor, giving him time to review his approach one final time. The manor was more beautiful than the photographs had suggested. Set in rolling countryside about 90 minutes from London, it represented the kind of English elegance that attracted tourists from around the world. James could understand why the former queen consort had chosen it as a retreat and why Catherine had been reluctant to leave. Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper, greeted James at the door with polite curiosity. He presented his credentials as a security consultant and asked to speak with Lady Whitmore about safeguarding valuable items during her upcoming move. Catherine appeared in the main hallway a few minutes later, and James was struck by her composure despite the obvious stress she must be experiencing. She was an attractive woman in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess him carefully as they shook hands. Mr. Thornfield, I understand you're here about security arrangements, she said, her voice steady but cautious. That's correct. Moving valuable items requires careful planning, especially when dealing with artwork and personal documents. I'd like to discuss some concerns that have been raised about the security of certain materials. Catherine's expression didn't change, but James noticed a subtle tension in her shoulders. She led him to a comfortable sitting room where they could speak privately. What specific concerns? She asked once they were seated. James had planned this conversation carefully, intending to be direct but diplomatic. Lady Whitmore, I think we both understand that your friendship with the former queen consort may have resulted in your possessing materials that could be misinterpreted if they fell into the wrong hands. Personal letters, photographs, perhaps recordings of private conversations. Catherine studied him for a long moment before responding. Mr. Thornfield, may I ask who you really work for? Because you don't seem like a typical security consultant. Her perceptiveness impressed him, but James maintained his cover. I work for a firm that specializes in protecting high-profile clients from security breaches and privacy violations. The Crown Estate has hired us to ensure that all parties' interests are protected during this transition. And what exactly are my interests in this situation? Catherine's tone remained polite, but there was steel underneath. Your interest is in avoiding unwanted media attention and legal complications. Materials obtained during your friendship with the former queen consort could be viewed as royal property, depending on their nature. We prefer to handle this discreetly rather than through formal legal channels. James watched Catherine process this veiled threat, noting the way her hands clenched briefly before relaxing. She was clearly intelligent enough to understand the implications of his words. I see. And what would happen to these hypothetical materials if I were to cooperate? They would be secured appropriately to protect everyone's privacy and reputation. No one has any interest in embarrassing you or damaging the memory of your friendship with the former queen consort. Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ground she would soon lose. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. She's dead, isn't she? Isabella. They said it was an accident, but you wouldn't be here if that were true. The question hit James like a physical blow. He had been briefed about the former queen consort's death, but only in terms of its impact on the current operation. The possibility that it might not have been accidental had never been suggested to him. Lady Whitmore, I have no information to suggest that the former queen consort's death was anything other than a tragic accident. My presence here is solely about protecting materials that could be harmful if misused. Catherine turned back to face him, and James saw tears in her eyes for the first time. She was terrified in those final months. She said people were watching her, following her, trying to control every aspect of her life. She felt like a prisoner. The life of a royal can be very isolating, James said carefully. Security concerns often create an atmosphere of suspicion that may not reflect actual threats. You don't understand. Isabella wasn't paranoid. She was intelligent and observant. If she felt threatened, there was probably a good reason. James found himself in an unexpected position. His assignment was to secure potentially sensitive materials, but Catherine's words raised questions about the circumstances surrounding the former queen consort's death. If there was any truth to Catherine's suspicions, then his role in this operation might be more morally complicated than he had realized. Lady Whitmore, regardless of what may or may not have happened to the former queen consort, you're in a vulnerable position right now. The best way to protect yourself is to cooperate with this process and move forward with your life. Catherine laughed bitterly. Move forward what? My reputation has been destroyed. My career is finished. And now you're here to take away the only evidence that might someday prove Isabella was telling the truth about her situation. What kind of evidence? The question slipped out before James could stop himself, driven by genuine curiosity rather than professional duty. Recordings of her conversations where she talked about feeling trapped, about being threatened when she tried to assert any independence. Letters where she described the psychological pressure she was under. Documentation of how they systematically destroyed her credibility when she tried to leave. James felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. If such materials existed and contained the kind of allegations Catherine was describing, then his assignment involved suppressing evidence of potential abuse or worse. He had joined the royal guard to protect the monarchy, not to cover up crimes. Lady Whitmore, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe the former queen consort was murdered? The blunt question hung in the air between them. Catherine's eyes searched his face, as if trying to determine whether he was friend or enemy. I think Isabella became inconvenient to powerful people, and convenient people don't die in mysterious single-car accidents on empty roads, she said finally. And I think I'm about to become equally inconvenient. James felt the weight of moral responsibility settling on his shoulders. If Catherine was right, then he was being used to help cover up a potential murder. But if she was wrong, then he was allowing conspiracy theories to cloud his judgment and compromise his mission. What do you want from me? He asked. I want someone to care about the truth. I want someone to ensure that if something happens to me, the real story doesn't disappear with me. Catherine stood and walked to an antique writing desk in the corner of the room. She returned with a sealed envelope, which she placed on the table between them. This contains copies of everything. Letters, photographs, transcripts of recordings. If I cooperate and give you the originals, will you promise me that this envelope will be given to a journalist I trust if anything happens to me? James stared at the envelope, understanding that accepting it would fundamentally change his role in this operation. He would be agreeing to potentially expose the very secrets he had been sent to protect. I can't make promises about evidence in a potential criminal matter, he said carefully. Then, we have a problem, Catherine replied, because I won't hand over those materials just so they can be destroyed and forgotten. James found himself at a crossroads that his training hadn't prepared him for. The Royal Guard's code emphasized loyalty, duty, and discretion above all else. But his personal moral code demanded that he consider the possibility that he was being asked to participate in covering up serious crimes. Lady Whitmore, I need some time to think about this. Can we continue this conversation tomorrow? Of course. But, Mr. Thornfield, I hope you'll consider the possibility that protecting the truth might be more important than protecting reputations. As James drove back to London that evening, his mind raced through the implications of what he had learned. If Catherine's suspicions were correct, then the former Queen Consort had been murdered to prevent her from revealing damaging information about the royal family. And now Catherine, the only person who possessed evidence of that information, was being systematically isolated and threatened. But James also had to consider the possibility that Catherine was a grieving woman whose judgment had been clouded by loss and stress. Conspiracy theories often seemed more plausible to people who felt powerless and betrayed. Her materials might contain nothing more than the private complaints of an unhappy wife, misinterpreted through the lens of tragedy. That night, James lay awake wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. His career, his reputation, and his future in the Royal Guard all depended on completing this mission successfully. But his conscience demanded that he consider the moral implications of his actions. The next morning brought news that made James's dilemma even more acute. Colonel Morrison called him into an emergency briefing, his face grim with concern. "Captain, we've received intelligence that Lady Whitmore may have been in contact with journalists about her situation. The matter has become more urgent than we originally anticipated." "What kind of contact?" James asked. "Phone calls to Marcus Hartwell, the culture reporter. He has a reputation for investigating scandals involving high-profile figures. If Lady Whitmore is planning to go public with whatever material she possesses, we need to prevent that from happening." James felt his stomach tighten. If Catherine was already reaching out to journalists, it suggested she was preparing to tell her story whether or not the Royal Guard cooperated with her conditions. "Sir, what are my new instructions?" "Secure those materials today by whatever means necessary. We can't afford to have unverified allegations about the former Queen Consort circulating in the press, especially given the recent tragedy of her death." The phrase, "by whatever means necessary," sent a chill down James's spine. In Royal Guard terminology, it typically meant that normal legal constraints could be set aside in service of protecting the monarchy. Are we talking about a forcible search and seizure? We're talking about protecting the crown from potentially devastating false accusations. Lady Whitmore is a civilian who has found herself in possession of materials that could damage national interests if mishandled. Your job is to ensure that doesn't happen. James left the briefing with new orders that put him directly at odds with the moral compass that had guided his entire career. He was being asked to essentially steal evidence from a woman who might be the only person capable of exposing serious crimes. During the drive back to Ashford Manor, James made a decision that would define the rest of his life. When he arrived, he would give Catherine a choice: cooperate with a modified version of his original proposal, or face the consequences of refusing to help cover up what might be murder. But as he approached the manor's gates, James saw something that changed everything. Several black vehicles were parked in the circular driveway, and men in dark suits were carrying boxes out of the house. Catherine stood on the front steps, her face pale with shock and anger, while Mrs. Fletcher wept openly beside her. James's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. Someone had decided that his diplomatic approach was taking too long. The materials were being seized by force, and Catherine's cooperation was no longer required. He parked his car and approached the scene, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. Whatever was happening here had moved beyond his original mission parameters, and he no longer knew who he could trust or what he was really protecting. The leader of the search team noticed James's approach and walked over to intercept him. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Captain Thornfield? I'm Agent Davies, Special Branch. We're handling this matter now." "On whose authority?" James demanded. "Direct orders from the highest levels. Lady Whitmore is being relocated for her own protection, and sensitive materials are being secured to prevent their misuse." James looked past Davies to Catherine, who was watching their conversation with desperate hope in her eyes. She clearly believed he might be her only chance of protection against whatever was happening to her. "Where is Lady Whitmore being relocated?" James asked. "That information is classified for security reasons. I'm sure you understand the need for operational security." James didn't understand anything anymore. His assignment had been transformed into something unrecognizable, and he was beginning to suspect that Catherine's darkest fears about the forces arrayed against her were entirely justified. As he watched the systematic dismantling of her life, James realized that he was witnessing the same process that had been used against the former queen consort. Isolation, intimidation, and the slow destruction of credibility until the victim became completely powerless to resist. The question now was whether James would continue to be a part of that machinery or whether he would find the courage to stand against it. Looking into Catherine's eyes, he knew the choice he had to make would determine not just her fate, but his own soul's survival as well. The secure holding facility was nothing like the comfortable interrogation rooms James had imagined from television shows. Located in an anonymous government building in central London, it consisted of sterile white walls, fluorescent lighting, and furniture bolted to the floor. Catherine sat across from him at a metal table, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale, but determined. 48 hours had passed since the raid on Ashford Manor. Catherine had been brought here for her own protection, according to Agent Davies, but the locked doors and constant surveillance suggested something closer to imprisonment. James had requested permission to interview her as part of his ongoing investigation, though he was no longer certain what he was investigating or for whom. "They haven't formally charged you with anything," James said quietly, aware that their conversation was being recorded. "This is still classified as protective custody." Catherine's laugh was bitter and hollow. Protection from what? From telling the truth about Isabella's death? From sharing evidence that might embarrass powerful people? James glanced at the one-way mirror that dominated the far wall, knowing that Agent Davies and others were watching every gesture and listening to every word. He had to be careful about how he approached this conversation, but he also felt an overwhelming need to understand what had really happened to bring them to this point. "Lady Whitmore, I need you to tell me exactly what materials you had at the manor. Everything. The more complete your cooperation, the more likely we are to resolve this situation favorably." Catherine studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. When she spoke, her voice was steady but filled with sadness. "Isabella started confiding in me about 18 months ago. She was having serious marital problems, far beyond what the public knew. King Edward wasn't just controlling. He was psychologically abusive. He monitored her communications, restricted her movements, and threatened to destroy her reputation if she ever tried to leave him." James felt his pulse quicken. If Catherine's allegations were true, they painted a picture of domestic abuse at the highest levels of the monarchy. Such accusations could destabilize the entire institution if they became public. "Did you have documentation of these allegations?" "Isabella wrote to me regularly about her situation. At first, I thought she was just venting her frustrations like any unhappy wife might. But over time, the letters became more desperate. She started describing specific incidents of threats, manipulation, and isolation." Catherine paused, her eyes distant as she remembered. The recordings were Isabella's idea. She was required to practice her public speeches, and she asked me to help her rehearse. But after the official practice sessions, she would often keep talking, using the recordings as a kind of therapy. She would describe her fear, her growing realization that she was trapped, her desperate desire for freedom. "What did she say specifically about King Edward?" Catherine hesitated, clearly understanding the explosive nature of what she was about to reveal. She said he told her that if she ever tried to divorce him or speak publicly about their marriage, he would ensure that she was discredited so thoroughly that no one would ever believe anything she said. He had detailed plans for destroying her reputation, her finances, and her relationships. James felt sick as he listened to Catherine's account. If even half of what she was saying was true, then the former queen consort had been the victim of a sophisticated campaign of psychological abuse designed to trap her in an impossible situation. Did Isabella ever mention being in physical danger? Not directly, but in her final weeks, she became convinced that she was being followed and that her communications were being intercepted. She started using coded language in her letters, referring to the watchers and the cleaners who seemed to be monitoring her every move. Catherine leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The night before she died, Isabella called me in a panic. She said she had decided to leave England permanently and that she wanted to retrieve some personal items she had hidden at the manor. She was supposed to come that morning, but instead I heard about her accident on the news. What personal items was she planning to retrieve? A safety deposit box key and some documents she had hidden in the manor's library. Insurance policies, bank account information, evidence that she had been secretly moving money out of accounts controlled by the Crown Estate. She was planning her escape very carefully. James realized that if Isabella had been systematically moving money and preparing to flee the country, it would have represented a massive embarrassment to the monarchy. The image of a queen consort so desperate to escape her marriage that she would steal royal assets and flee into exile would have been devastating to public confidence in the institution. Where are these documents now? I assume they were found during the raid on the manor. I never had a chance to look for them myself. James made careful notes of everything Catherine told him, knowing that her testimony would be crucial evidence if formal charges were ever filed. But he also knew that powerful forces were working to ensure that such charges would never see the light of day. Lady Whitmore, I need to ask you about your contact with Marcus Hartwell. What exactly did you discuss with him? Catherine's expression hardened slightly. Marcus is one of the few journalists in London who isn't completely controlled by palace influence. I reached out to him because I believe the public had a right to know the truth about Isabella's situation. What specifically did you tell him? I told him that Isabella's death was suspicious and that I had evidence suggesting she had been the victim of systematic abuse. I asked him to investigate her car accident and to look into the circumstances surrounding our divorce proceedings. James felt a chill run down his spine. If Catherine had shared even a portion of her allegations with a journalist, then the situation was far more explosive than he had realized. Marcus Hartwell had a reputation for thorough investigative work and wasn't easily intimidated by powerful interests. Did you provide him with copies of any documents or recordings? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. I prepared a complete package of evidence for Marcus, but I never had the chance to deliver it. The raid happened before we could meet. Where is this package now? That's the question, isn't it? Catherine's smile was grim. I hid it very carefully, but I assume your colleagues found it during their search. James suspected that Catherine was being deliberately vague about the location of the evidence package. She was probably smart enough to have created multiple copies and hidden them in different locations as insurance against exactly this situation. The interview was interrupted by Agent Davies entering the room with a folder of documents. He nodded curtly to James before taking a seat at the table. Lady Whitmore, we've completed our analysis of the materials recovered from Ashford Manor. I'd like to discuss some of the items we found. Davies opened the folder and spread several photographs across the table. James recognized images from what appeared to be Isabella's personal correspondence, along with transcripts of recorded conversations. These materials contained serious allegations against members of the royal family, Davies said, his tone neutral but threatening. Allegations that could be considered treasonous if they were proven to be false or maliciously motivated. Catherine stared at the documents, her face pale but defiant. Those allegations are true. Every word Isabella wrote or spoke was her honest account of what she experienced. The problem, Lady Whitmore, is that the former queen consort is no longer alive to confirm or deny these statements. Without corroboration, they amount to unsubstantiated gossip that could cause immense damage to national institutions. James watched this exchange with growing unease. Davies was essentially arguing that because the victim was dead, any evidence of abuse should be suppressed to protect the reputation of her alleged abuser. The logic was chilling in its cynical practicality. What about the documents relating to financial irregularities? James asked. If the former queen consort was moving money inappropriately, that could be verified through banking records. Davies shot James a sharp look, clearly annoyed by the question. Those matters are being handled by the appropriate financial authorities. Our concern is preventing the spread of unverified personal allegations. Catherine suddenly spoke up, her voice clear and determined. What if I'm willing to swear under oath that everything Isabella told me was true? What if I'm prepared to testify publicly about what I witnessed? That would be very inadvisable, Davies replied smoothly. Personal testimony based on hearsay and emotional conversations wouldn't hold up in court, but it could expose you to serious legal liability for defamation. James realized that Davies was essentially threatening Catherine with prosecution if she attempted to go public with her story. The message was clear: cooperate with the cover-up or face criminal charges for speaking the truth. What exactly are you proposing? Catherine asked. Davies leaned back in his chair, assuming the posture of someone about to make a generous offer. We're prepared to relocate you somewhere comfortable and secure with a financial settlement that would allow you to rebuild your life and career. In exchange, you would agree to a confidentiality agreement regarding your relationship with the former queen consort. You're offering to buy my silence. We're offering to protect your future while also protecting the dignity of the monarchy during a difficult period of transition. Catherine looked directly at James, her eyes pleading for some sign that he understood the moral implications of what was being proposed. And if I refuse, then you would remain in protective custody while we investigate potential charges related to the improper handling of royal property and possible violations of the Official Secrets Act. James felt his stomach turn as he listened to Davies calmly threaten an innocent woman with imprisonment for the crime of possessing evidence of abuse. The Royal Guard's mission to protect the monarchy had been twisted into something unrecognizable, a machinery for suppressing truth in service of preserving appearances. I need some time to consider your offer, Catherine said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need, Davies replied, though his tone suggested that patience was limited. After Davies left the room, James and Catherine sat in silence for several minutes. James was acutely aware that their conversation was being monitored, but he felt compelled to say something that might offer her some hope. Lady Whitmore, I want you to know that there are still people in law enforcement who care about truth and justice. This situation is complicated, but it's not over. Catherine's eyes searched his face, looking for signs of genuine sympathy or support. Captain Thornfield, do you believe Isabella was murdered? The question hung in the air like a live wire. James knew that his answer could determine the course of both their lives, but he also knew that he couldn't continue to participate in what increasingly felt like a conspiracy. I believe that powerful people sometimes do terrible things to protect their interests, he said carefully. And I believe that the truth has a way of emerging eventually, no matter how many people try to bury it. Catherine nodded slowly, understanding the limitations of what he could say openly. But she also seemed to take some comfort from his carefully worded expression of solidarity. That evening, James returned to his apartment in London with his mind in turmoil. He had joined the Royal Guard because he believed in serving something greater than himself, protecting an institution that represented stability and continuity in an uncertain world. But his recent experiences had shown him that the machinery of that protection could be turned to dark purposes, crushing innocent people who happened to inconvenience powerful interests. James spent hours researching the circumstances of Isabella's death, using his security clearance to access police reports and forensic evidence that weren't available to the public. What he found disturbed him deeply. The former Queen Consort's car had left the road at high speed on a clear night with no apparent cause. There were no skid marks to suggest braking, no evidence of mechanical failure, and no witnesses to the accident. Most troubling of all, the crash had occurred less than 2 miles from a remote airfield where a private jet had been waiting to take Isabella out of the country. She had been literally minutes away from escaping when her car inexplicably crashed into a stone wall at over 70 miles per hour. The more James investigated, the more convinced he became that Catherine's suspicions were justified. Isabella's death had all the hallmarks of a professional assassination designed to look like an accident. The timing was too perfect, the circumstances too convenient, and the aftermath too carefully orchestrated to be coincidental. James also discovered that he wasn't the only person asking uncomfortable questions. Marcus Hartwell had been conducting his own investigation into Isabella's death, and his preliminary findings echoed many of Catherine's concerns. The journalist had requested access to the crash site, the vehicle wreckage, and the preliminary autopsy report, but all of his requests had been denied for security reasons. As James pieced together the evidence, he began to understand the true scope of what Catherine possessed. Her materials didn't just document an abusive marriage. They provided a detailed record of how the monarchy dealt with inconvenient members who threatened its carefully maintained image. If her evidence became public, it would expose not just King Edward's personal behavior, but the entire system of intimidation and control that kept the royal family's secrets buried. The next morning brought news that forced James to make the most difficult decision of his career. Catherine had been found unconscious in her cell, apparently having attempted suicide during the night. She was in critical condition at a nearby hospital, and doctors were uncertain whether she would survive. James knew immediately that Catherine hadn't tried to kill herself. She had been too determined, too focused on exposing the truth to give up so easily. Someone had decided that her continued existence posed an unacceptable risk and had tried to eliminate that risk permanently. Standing outside Catherine's hospital room, watching her unconscious form connected to life support machines, James finally understood what he had to do. The royal guard's oath was to protect the crown, but the crown was supposed to represent justice, honor, and the protection of the innocent. If the institution had become so corrupted that it would murder its own critics, then James's highest duty was to expose that corruption and help restore the honor it had lost. He made a phone call to Marcus Hartwell and arranged to meet at a secure location that evening. James had no idea if Catherine had managed to get evidence to the journalist before her suicide attempt, but he knew that he possessed enough information to at least ensure that her story would be told. As he prepared to betray everything he had sworn to protect, James reflected on the irony that saving the monarchy might require destroying the people who currently controlled it. If the crown was to retain any moral authority, it had to be cleansed of those who had perverted its purpose for their own protection. Catherine stirred slightly in her hospital bed, and for a moment her eyes opened. She looked directly at James with an expression that seemed to convey both gratitude and determination. Then her eyes closed again, leaving James alone with his thoughts and his resolve. He would not allow Catherine to become another convenient casualty in the monarchy's war against truth. If powerful people thought they could silence witnesses through intimidation and violence, they would learn that some secrets were too important to stay buried. James just hoped that he would have the courage to see this through to the end, whatever the personal cost might be. The abandoned warehouse in East London felt like a world away from the polished corridors of power where James had spent his career. Marcus Hartwell sat across from him at a makeshift table, a digital recorder between them and stacks of documents spread across the surface. The journalist's face was grave as he listened to James's account of the past week's events. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Marcus said, pausing the recorder temporarily. "You're telling me that Lady Catherine Whitmore was essentially imprisoned for possessing evidence that the former Queen Consort was murdered, and that when she refused to surrender that evidence, someone attempted to kill her?" James nodded, the weight of his betrayal sitting heavy on his shoulders. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And I have reason to believe that similar methods have been used before to silence other inconvenient witnesses." Marcus had been investigating irregularities surrounding Isabella's death for weeks, but he had lacked the inside perspective that James could provide. The captain's testimony filled in crucial gaps in the journalist's understanding of how the royal protection apparatus operated when it felt threatened. "What's Catherine's current condition?" Marcus asked. "Stable, but still unconscious. The doctors say she ingested a massive dose of sedatives, but they found no evidence that she had access to such medications in her cell. The official report will probably conclude that she somehow obtained pills from another source and hoarded them for a suicide attempt. But you don't believe that. Catherine Whitmore was fighting for her life and the truth about her friend's death. She wasn't suicidal. She was determined. Someone wanted her silenced permanently, and when intimidation failed, they tried murder." Marcus made notes on a legal pad while considering the implications of James's allegations. "Captain, you understand that what you're describing amounts to a conspiracy at the highest levels of government. If you're right, we're talking about murder, false imprisonment, and the systematic suppression of evidence." "I understand the stakes," James replied quietly. "I've spent 12 years protecting the monarchy because I believed in what it represented. But I can't protect an institution that has become so corrupt that it murders innocent people to preserve its secrets." The journalist studied James carefully, clearly trying to assess his credibility and motivations. "What evidence do you have to support these allegations beyond your personal observations?" James produced a thick folder from his briefcase, containing copies of documents he had obtained through his security clearance. Internal communications about the Whitmore operation, forensic reports from Isabella's crash site, financial records showing unusual payments to private security firms, and witness statements that were never included in official reports. Marcus examined the documents with growing excitement and alarm. "This is extraordinary. If authentic, this material provides documentary evidence of a cover-up extending far beyond the original incident." "There's more," James said, producing a small digital device. I've been recording conversations with my superiors about this operation. I have Colonel Morrison discussing the need to neutralize potential threats to royal reputation, and Agent Davies explicitly talking about framing Catherine for crimes she didn't commit. The recordings played in the warehouse's echoing space, creating an eerie atmosphere as voices discussing conspiracy and murder bounced off concrete walls. Marcus listened intently, occasionally stopping the playback to ask clarifying questions about context and timing. Captain, this material is explosive, but it's also dangerous. If these people are willing to kill to protect their secrets, what makes you think they won't come after both of us? James had been wrestling with that question since deciding to come forward. Because exposure is our only protection. As long as this information remains secret, we're vulnerable to being eliminated quietly. But once it becomes public, harming us would only confirm everything we're alleging. That's assuming we can get this information out before they stop us, Marcus pointed out. They have resources we can't match, and they've demonstrated a willingness to use violence. Which is why we need to move quickly and comprehensively. I'm not talking about releasing bits and pieces of information over time. I'm talking about a coordinated exposure that reveals the entire conspiracy at once, making it impossible to contain or discredit. Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what James was proposing. What you're describing would bring down the government. If King Edward is implicated in murdering his wife and covering it up, the monarchy itself could collapse. Maybe it should collapse, James said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Maybe an institution that protects itself through murder has forfeited its right to exist. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, each contemplating the enormity of the decision before them. Finally, Marcus spoke. I'll need to verify everything you've given me through independent sources. Some of these documents can be authenticated through forensic analysis, and I have contacts who can confirm whether the financial transactions actually occurred. But that will take time. How much time? 2 weeks minimum, possibly more. I can't publish allegations this serious without ironclad verification. The legal and political consequences would be catastrophic if we got anything wrong. James felt frustration building in his chest. 2 weeks might be too long. If Catherine dies, we lose our primary witness. And if they realize I've gone rogue, they'll take steps to discredit or eliminate me. Then, we need to ensure Catherine's safety while I complete the verification process. Do you have any ideas about how to accomplish that? James had been thinking about this problem since deciding to approach Marcus. I have contacts in other law enforcement agencies who might be willing to provide protection if they understood the stakes. The problem is determining who can be trusted and who might be compromised. What about international law enforcement? If this conspiracy involves murder and other serious crimes, Interpol or the European authorities might have jurisdiction to intervene. The suggestion sparked an idea in James's mind. There's someone at Scotland Yard who I trust completely. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun has a reputation for integrity and independence. She's also worked on several high-profile cases involving organized crime and corruption. Do you think she would be willing to investigate these allegations? If I can convince her that the evidence is genuine, yes. Sarah has never been intimidated by powerful people, and she's one of the few investigators in London who hasn't been co-opted by political considerations. Marcus made notes about the potential Scotland Yard connection, while James continued thinking about protective strategies. We also need to consider the international implications of this story. Isabella had family in several European countries who might be willing to demand an independent investigation if they understood what really happened to her. That's an excellent point. Her brother is a prominent banker in Switzerland, and he's been privately expressing doubts about the official account of her death. If we could provide him with evidence of murder, he might have the resources and motivation to pursue justice through international channels. The conversation was interrupted by James's phone buzzing with an urgent message. As he read the text, his face went pale with alarm. What is it? Marcus asked. Catherine is awake, and she's asking for me specifically. But the message is from Agent Davies, which means they know she's conscious and probably planning to interrogate her again. That could be an opportunity, Marcus suggested. If you can get access to Catherine, you might be able to warn her about what's happening and coordinate our next steps. Or it could be a trap. Davies might suspect that I've compromised the operation and be using Catherine as bait to draw me out. James weighed his options carefully, knowing that his next decision could determine the fate of their entire enterprise. If he visited Catherine, he might be walking into a situation where his loyalty would be tested definitively. But if he didn't go, he might lose his last chance to protect her and gather additional evidence. I'm going to see her, he decided finally, but I want you to proceed with the verification process regardless of what happens to me. If I disappear, or if something happens to Catherine, publish everything we've discussed tonight. Marcus nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of James's commitment. Captain, I want you to know that what you're doing takes extraordinary courage. Most people in your position would choose personal security over moral duty. I'm not sure it's courage, James replied as he gathered his documents. It might just be the realization that I can't live with myself if I continue to be part of this system. The drive back across London gave James time to prepare for what might be his final conversation with Catherine. He reviewed everything they had discussed and tried to anticipate what questions Davies might ask about their previous interactions. Most importantly, he considered how he might warn Catherine about the dangers she faced without alerting her interrogators to his changed loyalties. The hospital was heavily guarded when James arrived, with security personnel from multiple agencies positioned throughout the building. He recognized several faces from the Royal Guard, but also saw agents from Special Branch and what appeared to be private security contractors. The level of protection suggested that powerful people were taking no chances with Catherine's safety or with controlling access to her. Agent Davies met James at the entrance to the secure wing where Catherine was being held. The man's expression was neutral but watchful, suggesting that he might have suspicions about James's recent activities. Captain Thornfield, thank you for coming so quickly. Lady Whitmore has been asking for you specifically, which is somewhat unusual given her previous reluctance to cooperate. What's her mental state? James asked, confused and disoriented, which is to be expected after her suicide attempt. The doctors say she may experience memory problems related to the overdose, which could actually work in our favor. James felt his stomach clench at Davies's casual dismissal of Catherine's condition as potentially beneficial to their operation. The comment confirmed his worst suspicions about the true nature of her suicide attempt. Has she said anything significant since regaining consciousness? She keeps asking about some package she claims to have hidden at the manor. The search teams didn't find anything matching her description, so she's either confused or lying about having additional evidence. James followed Davies through several security checkpoints to Catherine's room, where she lay connected to various monitoring devices. Her face was pale, but alert, and her eyes tracked toward the door as they entered. Captain Thornfield, she said weakly, I'm glad you came. I need to tell you something important. Davies took a position near the door, clearly intending to monitor their conversation closely. James approached Catherine's bedside and sat in the chair positioned there for visitors. Lady Whitmore, I'm relieved to see you recovering. Everyone was very concerned about your condition. Catherine's eyes flickered toward Davies before returning to James's face. I didn't try to kill myself, Captain. Someone came into my cell while I was sleeping and forced pills down my throat. I tried to fight, but they were too strong. Lady Whitmore, trauma can sometimes affect memory, Davies interjected smoothly. The medical staff found no evidence of forced ingestion, and the security footage shows no unauthorized personnel entering your cell. The footage was edited, Catherine said with conviction. I know what happened to me. James leaned closer to Catherine, speaking in a low voice. Is there anything specific you remember about your attacker? Any details that might help identify them? It was dark, and they were wearing some kind of mask. But I remember their voice. It was the same person who called me the night Isabella died, warning me to keep quiet about what I knew. This was new information that James hadn't heard before. Someone called you the night of Isabella's death? Around midnight, a man with a refined accent, speaking very calmly. He said that accidents could happen to anyone who didn't understand the importance of discretion. I thought it was just an empty threat at the time. Davies stepped forward, his expression hardening. Lady Whitmore, these allegations are very serious. Are you claiming that you were threatened before the former Queen Consort's death? I'm not claiming anything, Catherine replied with dignity. I'm telling you exactly what happened, whether you choose to believe it or not. James realized that Catherine was taking an enormous risk by speaking so openly in front of Davies. Either she trusted James completely, or she had decided that she had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Lady Whitmore, Is there anything else you think we should know about your relationship with the former Queen Consort or the events surrounding her death? Catherine looked directly into James's eyes, and he saw a flicker of understanding pass between them. She had recognized something in his manner that suggested his loyalties might have shifted. Captain, I want you to know that I've prepared comprehensive documentation of everything Isabella told me about her situation. If anything happens to me, I've arranged for that documentation to be delivered to people who will ensure the truth comes out. Davies's face flushed with anger at this revelation. Lady Whitmore, you are currently in protective custody pending investigation of serious charges. Threatening to release potentially classified materials would constitute an additional criminal offense. I'm not threatening anyone, Catherine replied calmly. I'm simply ensuring that if I die under suspicious circumstances, my friend's real story will be told. The tension in the room was palpable as Davies struggled to maintain his composure. James realized that Catherine had just made a strategic declaration of independence, essentially announcing that she couldn't be silenced through intimidation or murder because her evidence would survive her. Lady Whitmore, I think you should rest now, James said, standing to leave. The most important thing is your recovery. As he moved toward the door, Catherine called out to him. Captain Thornfield, please remember what I told you about the importance of truth. Some things are more valuable than personal safety. James nodded to her, understanding that she was giving him permission to do whatever was necessary to expose the conspiracy they had both stumbled into. As he left the hospital with Davies, James knew that he was committed to a course of action that would either restore justice or destroy him completely. The game had changed fundamentally. Catherine had demonstrated that she wouldn't be intimidated into silence, which meant that Davies and his associates would have to escalate their efforts to contain the situation. James suspected that the next few days would determine whether truth or power would ultimately prevail in this deadly struggle for the soul of the monarchy itself. The emergency session of Parliament was called for a Tuesday morning in late November, just as London's first snow began to fall. James stood in the public gallery, watching as Prime Minister Harrison rose to address a chamber filled with tension and barely contained panic. Below him, the green benches held men and women whose faces reflected the gravity of what they were about to hear. 3 days had passed since Marcus Hartwell's expose had exploded across international headlines. The Crown's dark secret, murder, cover-up, and the death of Queen Isabella had appeared simultaneously in newspapers across Europe and America, making it impossible for British authorities to suppress or discredit the story before it gained momentum. The verification process that Marcus had insisted upon had ultimately saved their lives. When Agent Davies and his associates realized that James had compromised their operation, they had moved swiftly to eliminate both him and Catherine. But by then, copies of all evidence had already been distributed to journalists, law enforcement agencies, and foreign governments across 3 continents. James's hand unconsciously moved to his shoulder, where a bullet wound was still healing beneath his suit jacket. The attempt on his life had come 2 nights after his final conversation with Catherine, when masked gunmen had ambushed him outside his apartment. Only his military training and a fortunate distraction from a passing police car had allowed him to escape with his life. Catherine had not been so fortunate. Her second suicide attempt had succeeded, according to the official reports. But Marcus's investigation had revealed that she died from a rare poison that had been administered through a foredrip, a substance that would have been virtually undetectable without specific toxicology tests that weren't routinely performed. Honorable members, Prime Minister Harrison began, his voice heavy with the weight of constitutional crisis. I stand before you today to address revelations that have shaken the very foundations of our democratic institutions and our constitutional monarchy. The Prime Minister's words echoed through the chamber as he outlined the evidence that had emerged over the past week. Bank records showing payments to assassination specialists. Audio recordings of government officials discussing murder as a policy option. Forensic evidence proving that Isabella's car accident had been caused by remote manipulation of her vehicle's electronic systems. Most damaging of all were Isabella's own recordings, her voice from beyond the grave, describing the systematic campaign of abuse and intimidation that had driven her to attempt escape from her marriage. Her words, preserved in Catherine's hidden evidence cache, had provided an intimate and horrifying account of life within a royal system that had lost all connection to justice or morality. The evidence presented to this parliament, and verified by independent international investigators, demonstrates that former Queen Consort Isabella was murdered by agents acting on behalf of individuals within the royal household. Harrison continued, his words falling like hammer blows in the silent chamber. Furthermore, Lady Catherine Whitmore was subsequently murdered to prevent her from revealing evidence of this conspiracy. James closed his eyes, remembering Catherine's courage in those final days. She had known that speaking the truth would likely cost her life, but she had chosen to honor her friendship with Isabella rather than accept the safety that silence would have provided. Her sacrifice had ensured that the conspiracy could not remain hidden forever. The international ramifications have been swift and devastating. Isabella's family had demanded justice through the International Criminal Court. The European Parliament had condemned the murders and called for sanctions against Britain until a full investigation was completed. Most significantly, the Commonwealth nations had begun questioning their continued allegiance to a monarchy that had proven itself capable of murdering its own members. His Majesty King Edward VII has been suspended from all constitutional duties pending investigation by international authorities, the Prime Minister announced. Prince William has been appointed as regent to ensure continuity of essential royal functions. A gasp rippled through the chamber at this unprecedented announcement. In over 1,000 years of English history, no monarch had ever been suspended from duty for criminal activity. The constitutional machinery that governed the relationship between Crown and Parliament was being tested in ways that its creators had never anticipated. James thought about the investigation that had led to this moment. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun had proven to be exactly the ally they had hoped for, taking James's evidence and conducting an independent investigation that had uncovered additional evidence of the conspiracy. Her work had revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances stretching back over a decade, suggesting that Isabella and Catherine were not isolated victims, but part of a systematic campaign to eliminate threats to royal reputation. The discovery of a professional assassination network with connections to several European intelligence services had transformed what began as a domestic scandal into an international crisis. It appeared that the British monarchy had been collaborating with foreign agencies to eliminate inconvenient individuals, trading state secrets for assassination services in a web of corruption that spanned multiple governments. The evidence suggests that this conspiracy involved not only British nationals, but also foreign intelligence operatives and private military contractors, Harrison continued. We are cooperating fully with international authorities to ensure that all responsible parties are brought to justice, regardless of their nationality or official position. James had testified before multiple investigative bodies over the past week, his insider knowledge proving crucial to understanding how the conspiracy had operated within the royal protection apparatus. His decision to come forward had destroyed his career and made him a target for assassination, but it had also helped expose a system of corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The personal cost had been enormous. James had been forced to relocate multiple times as threats against his life continued. His family had been placed in protective custody, and his children no longer attended their regular schools for security reasons. The life he had built during 12 years of loyal service had been completely destroyed by his decision to choose conscience over loyalty. But as he listened to the Prime Minister detail the charges being prepared against King Edward and his co-conspirators, James felt a sense of vindication for the sacrifices he had made. Murder charges, conspiracy charges, abuse of office, and violations of international law would ensure that the responsible parties faced consequences proportional to their crimes. The investigation has also revealed evidence of financial irregularities involving the Crown estate and private accounts controlled by senior royals, Harrison announced. Millions of pounds appear to have been diverted from public funds to pay for illegal activities, including the assassination program that claimed the lives of Queen Isabella and Lady Catherine Whitmore. The financial evidence had been particularly damaging because it provided clear documentation of the conspiracy's scope and duration. Bank transfers, encrypted communications, and payment records had created an irrefutable paper trail linking the royal household to criminal activities spanning multiple countries and criminal organizations. Marcus Hartwell's investigation had also uncovered evidence that the conspiracy had targeted other individuals over the years. Former royal protection officers who had raised concerns about irregular activities, journalists who had asked uncomfortable questions about royal finances, even members of parliament who had proposed reforms to royal transparency requirements. The assassination network had been used systematically to eliminate anyone who threatened the monarchy's carefully constructed public image. The Queen Mother has announced her intention to abdicate her position as head of the royal family, acknowledging that the institution has been irreparably damaged by these revelations. The Prime Minister continued. Prince William has indicated his willingness to serve as a transitional head of state while Parliament considers fundamental reforms to the constitutional monarchy. This announcement represented perhaps the most significant constitutional change in British history since the English Civil War. The voluntary dissolution of the traditional monarchy in favor of a reformed system represented an acknowledgement that the institution had become too corrupted to continue in its current form. James had mixed feelings about the monarchy's collapse. He had devoted his career to protecting an institution that he believed represented stability and continuity. But the revelations of the past week had shown him that the monarchy had become a vehicle for the very corruption and abuse that it was supposed to prevent. The international community's response,